The Bob Murphy Show, episode 331.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews, conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show. Today I am joined by Dan Kish, who is the Senior Vice President of Policy at the Institute for Energy Research, or IER. Kish has more than 25 years of experience on congressional committees focused principally upon natural resource and energy policies. His service includes the principal resource committees in the House and Senate, including 6 years as Chief of Staff for the Republicans on the House Resources Committee and 4 years on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee staff. So I worked with Dan. I used to be the chief economist for IER, the Institute for Energy Research, for many years, and so that's how I got to know Dan. And I just had always filed away. This guy has got some great stories. He's been around D.C. for a while. He knows how this system works, and he's got a good sense of humor about it all. And so that's why we're going to have him on. And again, as his bio and current position suggest, most of what we're going to be talking about are stories and analysis based on the interaction of the U.S. government with the energy sector in the U.S. But I think there's probably some other fun stuff mixed in there as well. So without further ado, here is my conversation with the man, the myth, the legend, Dan Kish. Mr. Kish, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Thank you, Bob. It's great to see you.
So you are the, Senior Vice President of Policy at the Institute for Energy Research, and that's how we met, because at one point I was the economist there. And I had just filed. Oh, well, thank you. And yeah. I had filed away when I was working with, I don't know if I ever mentioned it to you. I was like, at some point, when he's semi-retired or so, I might just get Kish and interview him, because this guy, he knows where the bodies are buried. Like that's kind of the the way you came off. And so I would like, can you first of all just explain to the listeners, like, how did you, like, kind of what's your background, and then how did you end up in energy policy?
Sure. Well, I went to school in a little place, Wabash College in Indiana. I was from the Midwest, Michigan. And they urged us, because that's one of the few all-male campuses still out there, to do some off-campus study, which I did in Washington my junior year, late 70s. And part of the job was, or part of the program was, to get an internship. And I didn't have any connections. I'm from, Podunk town in the Midwest. And so I was walking the halls in one of the office buildings on the house side, looking for someone who might need some work. And I saw Alaska, and this was immediately after the beginning of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. I think it was 78, and the pipeline started up in 77. And I thought, that's kind of nice. I liked that idea. So I walked in, and they were just in the middle of a huge bill by Jimmy Carter to make a huge amount. Texas would be the third largest state if Alaska were cut in half. And the federal government owns a huge amount of it, and promised the state they could select lands. And ultimately what happened was the federal government, believe it or not, went back on its word and grabbed all the lands that it wanted, and they were fighting over the designation of those. And so fast forward a year later, I was graduating and was planning on doing what everyone who doesn't know what to do in graduation from college does, which is go to law school. And I got a letter from this office, and they offered me a job. So I thought, you know what? That sounds preferable to just wandering around college for another several years. So I can do that later. And I took the job and got tied up with Alaska. And Alaska at that time was, it was Trans-Alaska Pipeline. It was 2 million barrels a day of oil, or almost, coming from the North Slope of Alaska. There were lots of land fights. I quickly worked my way to committee, and then ran the Resources Committee, the old Interior Committee, for a while. Spent some time in the Senate Energy Committee.
So, sorry, I'm even listening. Were you on like some particular congressional member's staff?
I was briefly for about a year and a half. For about a year, I guess. I was on Congressman Don Young from Alaska. He was the only congressman for a state that's over twice the size of Texas. And he was moving up. He had been elected first in 1973, and was moving up through seniority in the committee, and he asked me to go over to the committee and work for him over there. So that's how my committee life, which was almost all of my life on the Hill, started. Yep.
Okay, maybe this is a good point to ask. Well, and so then you were in like Washington. Well, I mean, I know you were in Alaska too, but were you involved in DC politics like from that whole time, or did you take a break off and you were in industry? Or
well, no, my entire life until I went to IER was pretty much on the Hill.
Okay.
Long time. Fighting battles. We were always fighting battles, whether it was what we would call land lockups, typically people from urban areas wanting to set aside areas where people have to make a living from our perspective. And the use of those lands is important to their transportation, to their commerce, to their variability to make a living off the land. But I was, I mean, you can't, I worked on Capitol Hill. I worked right across the street from the Capitol, and everything what we did was legislation. We passed laws.
Okay. And then your perspective of favoring markets as opposed to top-down regulation, like where did you have that already, or did you just kind of imbibe that over time, or just experience and you saw how much the government was screwy?
Yeah. I think that was probably my education at Wabash. Some of the economics courses I took, we had a professor at the time by the name of Ben Rogie, who was pretty renowned in free market economics. And I remember picking Milton Friedman up at the Indianapolis airport to bring him over for a lecture.
Oh, wow.
And
well, you've got one up on me. I certainly have never had Milton Friedman in my car.
Yeah, it was interesting. To be honest with you, I didn't even know who the hell he was, but
well, you knew he wasn't a basketball player.
No, he was not a basketball player, right? So, so I think that's where it came from. But honestly, Bob, the more I got exposed to, the fatal conceit of planners and people who want to design this and design that and, in essence, control people, the more I got a almost visceral dislike for it, because and that describes Washington quite well, honestly. Yeah. There's just this, it attracts some very smart people, but also some very dumb smart people. who know little about the things that they want to control, or the people they would seek to control. But they go ahead and do it anyway.
Maybe I guess we can go ahead and get to it right now. Yeah, because that's one of the things I want to ask you about is just your model of, or just the way you would characterize the type of people that do go into politics. That let me give you a quick story. I've told this on the podcast before, but I don't know if I ever told you this, Dan. There was one point when I did some work for Pacific Research Institute, which is a California state-based think tank, free market stuff. And I did a plan to change the California tax, to make it a flat tax. And the mandate I was given was it's got to be revenue neutral under plausible assumptions, but you go ahead and combine because they had like 6 brackets or something at the state level. And the top one, I don't remember the top one, but the top one was pretty high for a state. And, so I consolidated it, did a standard deduction in terms of the same revenue and with some assumptions about a little bit of growth and blah, 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 nothing crazy, but going from the empirical literature. And I got a pretty low number, and it was, everyone was excited at the number I was able to get, it was a low number. I forget what it was. I think it was 3. And so, and there was a newly elected Republican state level rep who got his hands on my pamphlet or whatever, the PR I put. And he called me, and I was, where the heck was I? I think I was in Nashville, and I've gotten a plane. He flew me out there. I met with him and his chief of staff, and this guy was gung-ho. He wanted to run on this. And, the conversation, it was like a 45-minute meeting. I was in there. And by the end of it, his chief of staff had talked him out. He was like, sir, you won't even get this out of committee. The other Republicans won't even let you get this through. And then it's not going to do anything. It's not going to help anybody. There's not going to be a vote. And on the next election, your Democratic opponent is just going to hang this on your head and say, this crazy nut job wanted to cut taxes on the rich by 15 points. Are you kidding me? And by the end of it, he's like, well, thanks, Dr. Murphy, for seeing, we'll be in touch. I never heard from the guy. And so that was kind of my eye opening that, even if you do have somebody who's, got the right spirit, and he wasn't he understood the economics of, he wasn't just some glad handler kissing babies and stuff. He really understood what my arguments were. And he was sharp. But again, by the end of it, his own the chief of staff wasn't even wrong. It's like I was mad at him. It was just I realized how much the system, how hard it would be to change it in the right direction. So anyway, do you have any thoughts on just have you seen that yourself? Even if people do want to do something and they go to Washington, how it's just no, the way that system is just, it's tough.
Oh, I think it sucks the life out of people, to be perfectly honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
We've all got examples that come to mind, but it is a company town, and the company is government. It's the largest business in the world. There are a lot of people who it's got more mercenary over time because of the growth of the enterprise itself. Is I don't know. What are we spending at the federal level this year?
I'm gonna have to look it up. I don't even know.
Yeah, I know. Eventually, you just get to a point where you sort of wing it, but it's become a huge enterprise.
Okay.
Washington.
This quick thing is saying in fiscal year 2023, the government said $6.13 trillion.
Yeah, that's a lot.
That's a decent chunk of change.
That's real money, and it more than that. It is involved in everything from from the type of healthcare we can get to the and for people who like to fiddle, to tinker, if you will. It's the perfect place because somebody can always come up with an idea, and it's actually popularized in the culture. How many times have we heard people say there ought to be a law?
Mm-hmm.
There ought to be a law, and it may be in an offhand way, but the idea is fix something for me, and it's the very thing. It's very hard to be one of those people like your California representative you were describing, who wants to shake the place to the ground, because there are there are incredible vested interests in the way things work now. Careers are planned around, gee, I'm the expert in this particular area, and I can therefore parlay that into explanations of that to people who have to do business with it. It's fascinating to me because many of the very most critical people, critical of industry, critical of practices, you name it, go into representing those companies because they know the way the critics work, and they have great value, bring great value to the table for those people interested in manipulating or stopping something bad from happening and that sort of thing. So, yeah, it's a swamp.
Yeah.
How's that?
So I guess maybe one way of putting it is, when I was younger, let me tell you a different one. So when I was younger, I got into free market economics. I went to Hillsdale College for undergrad, and I want to be an Austrian school professor when I grow up. And I knew, like, the minimum wage is dumb. That doesn't help poor workers. In fact, it raises unemployment among low skilled workers, and it just helps unions. But I thought at that time, when I was 19, that, the reason the politicians vote for minimum wage hikes is because they erroneously believe it helps poor people. And this guy Gary Wolfram, who was the head of the economics department, I mentioned that to him, and he was like, "No, they don't think that. It's to help the unions. What do you?" And he was laughing. He's like, "Okay, maybe one guy does in Washington." And then I was just like, "Oh." And so, because he was saying to me, "You don't think they have economists on their staffs that can show them, a standard textbook? You know what I mean?" And I was like, "Oh." So I guess that's the part of it, is how much, like, how cynical should the average person be about the people who go to they get up there and make speeches and whatever. Like, how much is it that, they're just misguided, they really are trying to help, and they just don't understand that their policies are counterproductive? Or how much is it like, they know exactly what they're doing, but they're just lying? Like, the real reason they're voting for this bill is because of blah, 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 but they got to sell it to their constituents, and they just get up there and they know they're lying.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know how cynical. Probably the answer to your question is not as cynical as I am. How's that? Some of them know. Some of them are clueless and couldn't find their way to the bathroom. I mean, in none of this is universal, obviously,
right.
Bob.
Yeah, and obviously be as nuanced as you want. I'm just wondering what your take is. Yeah.
But there are, the truth of the matter is, we send these people to Washington with the idea that they're going to become experts on our healthcare, on our how many miles per gallon our vehicles are supposed to achieve, on the innermost workings of the transportation system, how electricity gets ferried around, not because these are things that the Constitution says. I've always seen as the Constitution as this wonderful fence. These people, the founding fathers, blessed with the knowledge that they had, came up with to put a fence around government, keep it enclosed. And they've been banging on that foundation from the get-go, partly because it buys votes. You give people stuff, they respond. Hey, I'm responsible for this guy got me Social Security. This person got me an increase in my minimum wage. He's responsible for me. Now, on the other hand, there's somebody out there who doesn't quite connect the dots, who doesn't understand that they just got laid off because the company can't afford that minimum wage. And the value of the work isn't worth the minimum wage that they're required to pay them. So it's simply a tax. But all of these impulses come together to move to expand government. There's always somebody with a new idea about how to do something. And what did you do for me recently is a question I think a lot of them ask.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit? You mentioned before how you were on a certain committee. Can you just explain like the committee, like the role of that, and how it's not just enough to get elected, but then once you get to Washington, you're a young Republican or a young Democrat, and then like, oh, now you realize, oh, I have to get on a good committee. Like that's really where the power is, and that's how you advance. Can you just explain in whatever level of detail you want to people who are not, I mean, they've heard of committees and whatever, but how does that work? And like, how do
Sure.
they reward people and you get people in line, and you better not anger, your party head, because then you're not going to get a good committee assignment and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, well, that's kind of how it works. But it's also true that some people, for example, the committee that I had a surplus of people from Western states, representing rural districts from Western states, because that's where most of the federal land is, west of the Mississippi. And occasionally we would get an Easterner from a rural area with a national forest or something of interest. But part of it is almost like applying to a college and asking to get into a particular class, take a particular class. And I don't know how the triage is done on that, but the triage is definitely done with leadership support. It might be with an eye towards, and everyone has their own angle on it, but obviously the big committees are the tax writing committees, Ways and Means, and Senate Finance, and the committee, which is a party unto itself, and it shows, is the Appropriations Committee. But there are committees that deal with transportation and infrastructure, energy and commerce, which also includes a big piece of the healthcare regime is monitored by Washington. If someone has a background, it helps. They may be an attorney with not much else to say, but wanted to be on the Judiciary Committee, which is involved in overseeing the courts and so much more. And that's kind of how it works. And then there's a formula for each party, because these are chosen internally. There's a formula. People are elected by the whole body to represent, for example, states with one delegate, one Republican delegate, states with one Democratic delegate, get a vote. The speaker has numerous votes. There are rewards within the system. On the Republicans, it's called a steering committee. And people come in and audition, in essence, tell them why they want to be on it. I grew up on a farm. I'd like to be on the agriculture committee. I know something I've been in the business. I'm interested in small business, so I want to be on the small business committee. That's the way it's generally done. And then they have to decide, they have to do that triage I mentioned among the various people requesting seats. And then of course, everybody wants to be on the Appropriations Committee because they're the ones that roll out the money. And typically someone can find themselves in that position so that they roll it back to their constituency rather than someone else's.
So yeah, like I had heard like, oh yeah, like the Ways and Means Committee, that's a real, lucrative spot. You like, yeah, oh yeah, you want to be on that. And so this is kind of simplistic. I think I vaguely know the answer, but it would help if you said it specifically. So how does it work? If I'm newly elected and I get in there and I'm my own person and I don't need to be a committee, is it that I literally can't introduce a new bill, or is it just, you get what I'm saying? Like what actually is it? Like, why do you need to be on a committee? What's so special about that?
Because all legislation flows through committees. It's assigned by virtue of the House rules. There are rules guiding who has jurisdiction over what. In our case, it was lands and waters and Indians and territories and you name it. In the case of someone needs to be on a committee, typically not to introduce legislation. Anyone elected and inaugurated into the body has the right to introduce legislation, but it's up to that committee whether they take it up. There are thousands of bills introduced every year.
Okay.
And the chairman of the committee and his staff weed through these various things and have to listen to the cajoling and the begging and the, threats and all the rest from whoever introduced a bill in order to pick it up. And sometimes they may just make it a part of another bill, an amendment, if it's germane, as they say, to the subject matter at hand. But committees are where the Ways and Means Committee, for example, very seldom gets into, how many acres there are in a national forest out west. That wouldn't be their interest. They're interested in other things. If you can make the argument, for example, that energy produced on federal lands and waters in the U.S. contributes a huge amount to the national treasury, and they're interested in the means. Sometimes we can combine forces, and it could be multi-jurisdictional across the body for some particular thing, or we can go to them because, hey, here's a new source of money. Open up more lands, get more money.
Right.
Those sorts of things happen, but yeah, I hope. Does that work?
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's funny as you're saying that. My friend, when he went to college, his buddy, he hung out with a different kind of crowd, and they had a thing that for their frat that they called the Ways and Means Committee, and that was like how furniture mysteriously would show up in the frat house, and no one really asked, "Where'd you guys get that couch?" And it was like the Ways and Means Committee got it.
Right.
So,
Perfect.
Yeah. So I thought that was ironic. Like, I knew enough of politics at that point to say that's actually a pretty good term for what you guys are doing. Okay. So maybe we just circle back and talk a little bit more about energy. It's funny, like younger people now, I think they missed this, but I was born in 1976, and me growing up in the 1980s, it was well established as just a fact of the world that the United States is on the verge of running out of oil. We're heavily dependent on foreign sources, and that's why we need to quickly wean ourselves off of this because, the world's about to run out anyway, and, at the very least, we don't want to be dependent on the Middle East. And then all of a sudden in the 2000s, things changed, and now we don't use that talk, and now it's, carbon dioxide emissions are going to be the end of humanity, whatever. But there was a long stretch there where the idea that the U.S. would, once again surge to the top in oil output like that was inconceivable. Like, no, we're on the verge of running out. So can you comment on that and that change and how did they convince so many Americans of that narrative?
Well,
one last thing, Dan, just to tee you up, because when I was at IER, we had our North American inventory report that we did. I don't know if you guys still keep up with that. And I knew in principle about that, but I was even surprised by the numbers. There's just how many centuries worth of oil and natural gas and coal at current consumption rates, that is in North America alone, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. You'll be happy to learn, I think, Bob, that we just updated it.
Okay.
It's been, I think it was 13 years or something in the making, but we just updated it, and the numbers are larger than they were before, despite the fact that we've been consuming all of this oil in between. So this is like stone soup, I guess, or something. But what it really is it shows that resources, minerals, all kinds of things are actually, unless someone finds them, unless someone puts effort, blood, sweat, tears, money into getting them out of the ground, they don't exist. And that's the way typically the numbers were looked at. And in the inventory, what we did was take a look at what the geology says and the geologists say, and the scientists, if you will, because they are, who study such things. And what we find is that despite the fact that the United States has drilled more wells than the entire rest of the world combined on our lands and waters, we're the number one producer of oil and gas in the world. We have hundreds of years of both at current consumption rates, so we're not going to run out. And I would argue that a huge part of, and I think energy is actually a great way to study the way government works. It was in the early 70s, 73, the Yom Kippur War, that we got involved in. All of a sudden, we had shortages of oil in the United States, created, I would argue, by the government and its actions, but sold to the public as, gee, we're running out of oil. Wasn't the first time. I mean, the first time was in the 1800s. We were told we were running out of oil. And those were government reports. The USGS at the time was saying, gee, we've only got 20 years of oil left in the late 1800s. Based upon what they knew and based upon what people had done, it's an enterprise of the mind. This is created by, God giving us these minds and these capabilities and the hard work that go along with it. And the geology is pretty good, and it tells you how much oil there is in the world to know that the United States produces more than other people, and we have over history drilled more wells than the rest of the world combined. So how much oil can one project the world, which hasn't been looking very hard, actually has in the ground? So, but when the Middle East, I got my license in 1973, and so I got the wonderful pleasure of lining up, waiting for gasoline as a teenager, with a fresh license and wanting to go out there and drive and everything. And it made an impact on me. But what I came to find out was that there were huge resources belonging to the public. These are under government lands, but they're public lands. And the government was actually creating scarcity in order to, scarcity is a wonderful thing for people who are consumed with the management of power and the accumulation of power, because then it puts the government in the position to be able to do something about that. And whether that's forcing people to put solar panels on roofs or put up windmills or go to hydrogen or go to nuclear, or in the case of Jimmy Carter, it was a lot more coal plants, bringing on much more coal in the United States to burn to make electricity, because we were at the time burning a lot of oil to make electricity, and oil was getting scarce because we were running out of it. And it was in the 70s, late 70s, that we created the Department of Energy under Jimmy Carter, which created an entire bureaucracy within the federal government. The Interior and Insular Affairs Committee that I worked for took over some of those responsibilities. The Commerce Committee in the House of Representatives became the Energy and Commerce Committee under John Dingell, a famous powerhouse in the House of Representatives. The Interior Committee in the Senate, which had our similar jurisdiction under then Henry Scoop Jackson from Washington, took over, changed the name to the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So the entire platform upon which the government approached energy was everyone rushing in to grab some power and to grab some say over what kind of energy we could use, how we do it. That's when they cooked up CAFE. That was, I think, 74, which was the mileage standards for cars. It was at the same time they dropped the speed limit from 70 miles an hour on the highways, interstate highways, to 55. All of these things were done. Whole agencies were created and expanded and empowered and got more employees and got more money and bigger budgets and this and that and the other thing. All of that was created in Washington on the back of what I would argue, based on what we know today about our resources and what they certainly knew back then, was a false premise. Mm-hmm. But yet, look at what it's done. You know, there are lobbyists galore lobbying these agencies, these executive branch organs, these legislators on the Hill, all of them going in there to do something which it was never really contemplated that the federal government would be involved in the first place.
Yeah. I know some people that, you know, they really smell a big fat commie rat, and they think some of like the environmentalist movement is just, you know, either communists or socialists, just in a new guise that, oh yeah, we tried the frontal assault, that didn't work, so now we're going to restrain capitalism using this other rhetoric and so forth. And the thing that really made that seem real to me, where I was like, you know, is again working with IER, and it was with the, what the heck was it called? Renewable energy mandates that were at the state level, in terms of, oh yeah, a certain percentage of the electricity generated in this state needs to come from so-called renewable sources. And what I noticed was in the states where hydropower was actually feasible, you know, like near Niagara Falls or whatever, like where it actually would pass a market test, there hydro didn't count as renewable. Right. It was only in places where hydro made no economic sense that, oh yeah, if you can do it with hydro, that's renewable. But in areas where you could do 12% or, you know, making that number up from hydro, that didn't count. And so that was when I first started really thinking, like, something's screwy here. This does not seem like it's designed to, you know, they're just looking out for the planet. And of course, the big one is, if you want to, you know, limit CO2 emissions, you should be really big on nuclear power. And yet, at least for a long time, the people warning that we're all going to be dead in 12 years if we don't stop our emissions, we're also against nuclear.
Yes. And by the way, that pretty much holds true today. The same, if we could all decide that the answer is, or the problem is carbon dioxide somehow, and we need to ban fire, which is basically what they're trying to do. We have this backup source that we created in this country called nuclear power that has many problems, but most of them are created by government. I mean, the economics of a modern nuclear plant today isn't something I'd stand by, but believe it or not, I mean, a huge amount of that comes from government standing in the way and doubling and tripling the costs of a project by the time it's done. And then when they do that, they point to it and say that, gee, that's not economic. Mm-hmm. And they're right. It's not economic because they didn't want it to be economic. They don't want it to work, Bob.
Right.
You know, if there was one thing the folks who push this narrative regarding energy ought to be simple and easily resolved by people who specialize in understanding the way energy works and how much we consume. And we consume a lot. It's given us the standard of living that we have today. And that messing around with it, you don't mess around with energy because it is the capacity to do work. And sometimes some of those people who think that these are commies or something whisper in my ear and remind me that it seems like whenever something is about to work, it garners a lot of opposition. And I don't think it's necessarily because of their concerns over the environment or safety or anything else. But that makes a good story to cover the fact that they don't want it to work. Energy is affordable, reliable energy is key to people feeling comfortable and having children and doing other things in life because they think that things are taken care of. When there's shortage of those and people in the state government or federal government are figuring out who gets what and how much, that isn't a very prospective future for a lot of people, and it makes them nervous. So,
yeah, I had an eye-opening one. Do you remember this, Dan, when it was not Freakonomics, but the sequel, Super Freakonomics, and they had a chapter in there. It was Steve Levitt, and I forget what his co-author's name is. I think Steve Dubner. And they had a chapter in there. We're talking about like the geoengineering solutions to climate change. So folks, I should just say this, Dan, is neither Kish nor I are like on board with the world's going to end in 12 years if we don't. We're just saying, even on their own terms, if you genuinely believe that, then when someone comes out and says, "Oh, we've been studying a plan to, pump sulfur dioxide into the air, like kind of how Mount Pinatubo did, and we can buy us another 20 years before global temperatures rise," like that should be a good thing. You should be glad, like, "Oh, thank God, humanity's not going to all die." But no, they were outraged, and all the leftist progressive climate types did everything they could to discredit those like genuine scientists working at this, thinking. Right. Hey, we've been telling the world for the last 20 years that, this is an existential crisis. So I'm a good scientist. What do? I try to come up with a solution. And it looks like these global treaties aren't working. So let me try to come up with a technological fix. We'll put some algae in the ocean that'll suck up the CO2 or whatever. And these environmentalist groups were just outraged. Like, no, we need to be punished. We have consumed too much. Americans are bad. They need to be punished. And so a quick, a technological fix without the penance, that's no good because this is a religion. So am I being hyperbolic?
No, not at all. Actually, you remind me of one of my favorite reads, which was a speech done in 2003 before the, believe it or not, Commonwealth Club in San Francisco by Michael Crichton, who many of your listeners may be familiar with his books. He wrote Jurassic Park, Andromeda Strain. You probably know better than I do. A number of bestseller books after starting life as a scientist. I think at MIT or Harvard Med School. Decided he was doing better with books, so he went off on that. And he gave a speech to the San Francisco Commonwealth Club entitled Environmentalism as Religion, in which he proposed that, in his words, environmentalism is the religion of urban atheists, because it gives them all of the whole concept of virgin forest, Virgin Mary, this innocence, and we've sinned against it, and we must pay. And no matter how we get there, and no, you're not far from the mark at all. It gives some people, meaning in their lives. Because they're searching for something, and it's easy to hug a bunny or do something. I think we all care about the creation and protecting it. And I found in contrary to the popularized versions that we hear in the media, that many of the people who are actually out there working in it, whether they be a farmer or a fisherman or a logger or whatever, actually know more about their natural environment and appreciate it more because they rely on it. It's central to their being. And so they have an appreciation and a vision of nature that other people don't, in part, I guess, by consuming it, but also respecting it, and something, folks can't in an artificial concrete jungle.
Yep. By the way, you mentioned Michael Crichton. Have you ever read The Great Train Robbery? That's another book he wrote.
That's right. Yep.
And it's,
Yep.
I think it was based on a historic, like a true story that he, put in. I read that in a sitting. Like I started at like 10 o'clock at night in my bed, and I was up till 4 a.m. I couldn't stop. I was messed up the next day. That was a good read. Just to let people know.
He's good reads. Good reads.
All right. Well, since now we're talking about let's get into some of these fun stories of the Exxon Valdez spill. And you told me a story about what the government did, because they were so concerned about the impact on the wildlife. You remember which one I'm talking about?
Yes.
So you tell that story?
Well, yeah, I was on Good Friday in 1989, I think it was. I was in my office. It was a Friday, and we were just going to leave for the rest of the day. And got a call. I was working for the Alaskan congressman, who at the time was the chairman of the or the ranking member, as they call them when they're not in control. Their party's not in control. From the Coast Guard, informing us that a ship had hit a shoal in Alaska and spilled a bunch of oil. He gave a number, and I, at the time, wasn't familiar with whether that was a lot or a little, to be honest with you. It was kind of, but it was a lot. And that Sunday, I was in Alaska, in Valdez. We flew up on thanks to the taxpayers, a government jet, and we were on the scene. I was with a senator from Alaska at the time, and so started. I saw the very beginning of the spill. What happened was it got out of control. The spill actually was sort of contained, and the governments couldn't agree amongst themselves on what to do. They had a plan. They'd signed off on a month before, the state had, and that they were going to dissolve what they could and burn it. These are natural. They always come up with contingencies in the case something bad should happen, whether the military or the Coast Guard or transportation situations. Long and short of it is, thus began the entire Exxon Valdez melodrama, which went on for months. And part of the reason it went on for months was because Valdez is one of the prettiest places in the world. It's gorgeous. It's got fjords. It's the terminus of the pipeline. The pipeline starts on the north slope of Alaska, 800 miles south over several mountain ranges. And it's a 4-foot pipe. So it comes down to the water, which is ice-free year-round, and that's where they put it on tankers and shipped it to the West Coast. In the ensuing madness, and believe me, it was madness. You've never seen anything like it in terms of media and propped up pictures and all kinds of stuff. A good educational experience. One of the things that we found that later that summer was they were already the government was trying to figure out how much they were going to fine Exxon for having done this. And one of the problems is they couldn't figure out how many sea otters had died, how many birds had died, how many deer had died by coming in contact with the oil. And so they the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, a taxpayer-funded organization, decided the best way to deal with that was to go out and I should say the how many otters sink versus how many actually wash up on the beach. And you could count how many were dead on the beach, but gee, that wouldn't give you the entire picture of how many had actually died, because a lot of them are down in the bottom of the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So the Fish and Wildlife Service came up with this great idea that what they would do is they would go out, they would kill these animals. Deer, perfectly good deer, perfectly good. There's lots of deer in that part of Alaska. Otters, you name it. A lot of these are protected species. They killed them and dipped them in crude oil. I don't know how they did it, a barrel or a tub or something. They'd soak them in oil, then they'd toss them out in the ocean, out into the Prince William Sound. And depending on how many actually washed up, if they threw 100 and 10 washed up, then the number that they discovered on the beach naturally after the spill, we would multiply by 10. So if it was 50,000 a sea otter, we'd get 10 times whatever that. And they actually got caught because I talked to a journalist about it, and he wrote up the story, and it was a big story, and they dropped that one real fast. But you see,
so hey, I don't know if I knew that part. So like one man did make a difference. They were out there murdering poor Bambi, and Dan Kish stopped them. Is that true?
Right, right. Well, to me, and to other people that I shared it with, it was the epitome of sort of government doing its numbers game and arguing that they're protecting these things while at the same time. And I'm sure from their perspective, they look at this and say, well, gee, we had to come up with some number.
Right.
How do you expect us to do it? We couldn't divine how many have sunk. And, but the journalist was happy. I think he got an award for the story or something, but the Fish and Wildlife Service wasn't.
Hey, folks, let's take a break from the action to talk about today's sponsor, who is Monetary Metals. Now, Monetary Metals is providing a true alternative to saving and earning in dollars by making it possible to save and earn in gold and silver. Monetary Metals has been paying interest on gold and silver for over 8 years. Right now, accredited investors can earn 12% annual interest on silver, paid in silver, in their latest silver bond offering. For example, if you have 1,000 ounces of silver in the deal, you receive 120 ounces of silver interest paid to your account in the first year. So go to the link in the description of this show or head to monetary-metals.com/Murphy to learn more about how to participate and start earning a return on honest money again with Monetary Metals. Again, go to the link that's in the description of this particular episode, or just go to monetary-metals.com/Murphy to see how you can get on board. Okay, and then you told me a related story about the whales in the drum or something like that? The underwater drumming?
Yeah, this was one, there was, God, I think it was 87 or 88. I was up. This was right after Ronald Reagan had decided that this law that passed in 1980 designating all these lands in Alaska, signed by Jimmy Carter, left open to Congress in a presidential finding what we would do with something called ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is a sliver of land. It's actually a South Carolina-sized piece of land to the east of Prudhoe Bay, where all the oil is produced. But there's a sliver along the coast that has enormous potential for oil. Some people think it could be bigger than Prudhoe Bay. Some people say even larger than that. And it's been the course of people have heard about ANWR for decades, for good reason, because I think it was 1986 that Reagan came up with his recommendation after studying it, or after having his people study it, that yes, we should go ahead with proper safeguards and open it so that the Americans could get this oil. We were up there because legislation, I was there with my Democratic counterpart at the time, and we were flying around ANWR with the government on a small Twin Otter airplane, and they were counting whales. That was their job. These guys would take them up, and these biologists would count bowhead whales and try to keep a running deal on it. That's kind of, these are great jobs in the government. You get to fly around, look out the window for whales. While we were up there, or immediately before we got to the slope to do that, there had been 3 whales that had gotten caught in ice, and whales need a passage through because they have to come up and blow out water and get oxygen and come back down. And because the ice had come in, this is a natural thing, right? I mean, this happens in nature all the time. People don't know it because they don't see it. But because there was media there, they caught this in the village of Barrow on the north slope of Alaska. So we were there staying with the local county government, and they were taking us up in their helicopter, which was a search and rescue helicopter, to oversee this thing. And they had the Russians sent over an icebreaker. I think it was a nuclear powered icebreaker. They have better icebreakers than we do. And it was on the evening news, every night about these damn whales that are out there. And they had people were flying up. I remember we were at the Barrow airport, and believe me, it's dark. This time of year, it gets dark real early. You get about 4 hours of light. And it's dark 24 hours a day a little later in the year. But I remember the Alaska Airlines flight, or Wien Air Alaska at the time, was 737 lands on this ice strip, and the back steps come down, and these journalists from Australia come down. They're wearing shorts, right? And it's blowing, and there's snow and all the rest of it. And that was typical of the whole situation. Long and short, sorry, going on and on about this, but while we were up with the helicopter and talking to the guys from these are the Eskimos who support opening ANWR that never get told in the media. They live there. They want the jobs for their kids. They want the opportunities. It's very costly to live there. A gallon of milk is $12. Has to be flown in. And at any rate, they were telling us a story, and there were some people from Greenpeace there, from all over these people were coming in from Germany and from you name it. And there apparently was some guy there who was convinced that he was, by playing African tribal drum music, this would soothe the whales. And so he had a microphone on a cord that they cut a hole in the ice somehow and dropped this thing in there. Well, cranked it up too high, and one of the whales came up and whacked itself on the head on the bottom of the ice, breached, because he spooked the thing. And the whale just sunk to his demise. And the media stories today still recount about how it was unfortunate that one of the whales was lost, without giving due deference to the Greenpeace African tribal drummer biologist who offed the thing.
Yeah, because I don't think normally in nature there's tribal drumming underwater for the
Well,
whales.
the
Are like,
North Slope of Alaska is a far piece from African tribal drum music, but that's what it was. It was. These are the sorts of little bizarre stories that come along every
Mhm.
once in a while, and you just shake your head and say, "God, if people only knew."
Okay, what about? I might be getting it mixed up, but wasn't there some scandal with the Bureau of Land Management and they had to change their name? So I don't know if that's the new name or that was the old one. Like they were like having like parties with like
Ah,
hookers and cocaine. I think. I mean,
yeah, it was the Minerals Management Service,
okay.
which is the Minerals Management Service was designed to oversee the management of the offshore. The U.S. owns, to put it in perspective, the U.S. owns 700 million acres of subsurface in the United States. The mineral estate, if you will, the stuff you want if you buy land, and
Hmm.
because you get everything. Uh, they also own 1.76 billion acres of offshore lands. Combined, it's 2.46 billion acres. That's larger than the entire landmass of the United States, including Hawaii and Alaska. Um, that's how much mineral estate they own, and they're only touching a little bit of it. The MMS was designed to oversee the management of that resource, to hold lease sales, to raise money, and all the rest of it. And apparently, at some point along the way, there was one of their offices, I believe it was in Texas, where they were sort of cowboying it, and they apparently had great parties, and there were they were, uh, and as I recall,
They
there
were
was some.
stimulating the local economy.
They were definitely stimulating the local economy, no doubt about it, and everybody who came in contact with them apparently. So uh, there was some revenue raising aspect of uh, of a program that they ran, which they actually ran very well and made more money for the government the than the government would have done in its
Hmm.
old fashion. But this particular, they even called themselves the Royalty Rangers.
Okay.
Um, it was apparently a group, and they apparently brought some. They were having strippers and wild parties and all kinds of stuff. I think with some of the revenue that they were raising in addition to what the government would have gotten anyway, but it didn't pan out very well. Unfortunately, it killed the program because later they used that as part of the excuse for doing away with the government raising more money from by doing it more efficiently than they would in the old way, and they've gone
Right.
back to that old way, and that's unfortunate.
And were they the ones? They're no longer called the MMS. I know, like the scandal
They,
was so big, they literally changed their name because they just went
yeah,
from.
they did. They broke the agency into. It's now called the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management Resources, something,
Okay, yeah.
BOMER, and there's another part of it that counts the money, or that counts the leases and that sort of thing. But no matter, because honestly, and not to get too political, but under Biden, he hasn't done any leasing anyway. So
Yeah.
uh, any money they've got is money that's been coming in because it had been leased before. And they call that the Office of Natural Resource Revenue or something.
Okay. Okay.
And there may be another agency in there somewhere too, but they took, hey, it's Washington.
Yeah.
You take one agency, it's got a little problem, break it into three, then you can have three times as many people and three times as much money.
And then speaking of leasing, another one I remember just in terms of how insane everything was and how everyone just fights and automatically takes the opposite stand is was it? I know it was Nancy Pelosi. I guess it must have been under Obama, but we at IER were of course making the case for why wouldn't you allow for more leasing that brings in more revenue to the government? It increases oil, brings down gas prices for, motorists. Who's against this stuff? And Pelosi opposed it. I don't know if you remember this, the one I have in mind. She opposed it because she said, oh, yeah, we can go ahead and sell all these leases, but you know what? The statistics show that the oil companies only develop, 1 out of every 5 wells they drill, or whatever the number was.
Right.
Does that, you remember? And my point was, okay, so if you're worried about climate change, that's the best of all scenarios. These stupid oil companies pay you guys a bunch of money, and then they don't even drill. Like, why would you be against that, Nancy Pelosi?
Right,
Taking money from big oil, and there's no climate downside, right? But we're not going to take, because they're not going to actually drill and produce more oil for American motorists. That's all. And it was just like, what she was saying was so crazy. But anyway, I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the sort of nonsense that I remember we were arguing. These are sort of nonsensical arguments that apparently the media finds attractive, and they repeat infinitum. But partly I would allege because they like the agenda. But I remember I had a friend who was a fairly famous geologist, petroleum geologist on the North Slope. He was Scottish and had the brogue and the whole 9 yards, and had been living in the United States and Alaska for many, many years, and told me that the Arctic is just covered with oil underground, of course. There's enormous amounts, and when he was a young geologist, did some stuff in the Canadian Arctic, and was convinced that all signs were there that this is just absolutely loaded. And he was testifying, and at one point, the arguments about ANWR were always, we have to, it's going to kill all the caribou. And then we would show pictures of caribou, because I'd been at Prudhoe Bay a dozen times at least, pictures of caribou just walking down the roads and rubbing up against the pipeline to get away from mosquitoes and that sort of thing. And literally, they were frolicking amongst the pipelines all over the largest oil field in North America at the time. And eventually that one sort of ran dry on them. So, because how could it be that we have more caribou now than we did before they started oil drilling? And they had to drop that one. So they came up with, there's the ANWR is part of the Arctic, and it's a desert. And it's true. There's very little precipitation that falls yearly. It just blows away. The snow just blows from one end to the other. And my friend was testifying, and they asked him about that, and he said, "Gee, we don't seem to have much problem in the Middle East producing oil in a desert. We figure out a way to make it work." And so it's always something, it's caribou, right. It's black eye for your little brother. It's something to, in essence, stop it, and they'll use it. And for average people just sitting back and reading the AP story about it, they say the caribou are going to die. They think, gee, that's a unfortunate trade-off, at least. Or they pick up a sign and say, save ANWR.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess the reason that Nancy, the one I've told you about, the reason that stuck with me so much is that the people who were, and I picked up, of course, her talking points, or maybe she grabbed it from somebody else. I don't even know, how that stuff percolates up, and they all decide to copy each other, and then that's now the unified mantra. But it was like they hated oil companies so much that, like they were trying to think of what's the worst thing they could do is they could lie and say, we want to, get the rights to drill, and we're going to sell it as because it's going to lower gasoline, but actually we're not even going to produce oil. And I just want to say, so they're paying money to not drill? Why would they do that? That doesn't make any sense. You know what I mean? And like, right. and I remember like our people and, we're like whoever with the Heritage or Cato were like, Well, no, see, because the reason that statistic is what it is because they don't know where the oil is. So of course they have to drill test wells and they're just like taking it at face value. And I was just like, suppose you're right, Nancy Pelosi. Yes, just take their money and these idiot oil companies won't even produce any more oil. Why would that be a bad thing? But yet,
right,
with the
right, this is your chance to get even with them. Yeah, no, much of what passes for. It just doesn't pass a straight test. Next time you hear about one of these things, don't know much about it, walk it through in your head and see if the arguments make any sense. They don't really, but they seem to work. They get picked up, they get tossed around, and the one thing that's used a lot in these political debates and fights is statistics, the lying statistics that people will pull together in some form or fashion that everybody knows are just pure, unadulterated yak dung. But it becomes part of the mantra and just goes on and on and on and on. And seems to work. I think people deserve a better government than they get, but maybe was it Mencken who said that people deserve the democracy people get the democracy they vote for, and they get it really hard.
Yeah. How does it go? Democracy is the theory that the people should get the government they want good and hard, or something like that.
Right, exactly.
Okay, well, the time we have left here, I want to talk about Trump. Before we talk about current events, because I want to get your take as a veteran of DC, can you just, from your perspective, because let's give you the context here, Dan, people, I as you can imagine, I move in very radical libertarian circles, and when they talk about Trump, and they're like, oh, yeah, he had a good game and whatever, and I tell them, I can't speak for every aspect of his presidency, but I can tell you when it came to energy policy and, climate change, blah, 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 he was quite radical. And I said, because I know the guys he appointed, and they were like my buddies, and, I wouldn't have dreamed that those guys would ever have such high positions in federal agencies, and him pulling out of that treaty, that's not something George W. Bush would have done. So can you just speak to that a little bit about, Trump's first term and, how he was on energy and, climate change issues?
Yeah. I mean, Bob, I was around, I was at Reagan's first inaugural, chasing down some Iditarod sled dogs that had gotten stolen from the Alaska, part of the parade. But I was there. Reagan was a wonderful president, but honestly, Trump, when it came to energy, was better than anything we'd seen. Certainly better than Bush. The original offshore moratorium on oil drilling that shut off a huge amount of the coasts around the entire 1.76 billion acres that I was talking about, was initiated by Bush 1, and Bush 2 extended them until on his watch in 2008, and it was July of 2008 when the price of oil hit $147 a barrel. He lifted the presidential moratorium, and then Congress lifted the appropriations moratorium. Trump did what an amazingly courageous thing in dropping out of the UN agreement, the Paris Accords, largely because, the facts were that the United States had more rapidly reduced its emissions than anyone else. And yet we were somehow being bound because we had made the switch from coal to natural gas for making electricity. And so our emissions were coming down and had been coming down. and he just didn't like. And I'm sort of cantankerous like that too. I just don't like some people in Brussels and Paris and London telling Americans who have plenty of energy, they don't have any to speak of. You know, they start with a presumption that, gee, these guys have a leg up on us economically because they have so much oil, gas, and coal. So let's figure out a way to force them to not use that. And if we can get them to ink something that says we're not going to use oil, coal, and gas, that gives us that leg up. And the faster we get down the road, the better. Now we see the deindustrialization of Europe with Germany. We also see the political consequences, which are coming, as we saw in the EU elections this weekend. People are tired of being told they can't drive their cars. They have to shoot half their cows. They can't use fertilizer on their crops. All of which are energy based, all because these people tell them that they're destroying the climate. And so what, as far as energy goes, nobody better in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. I've not seen anyone better. He was just a breath of fresh air, and honestly, I didn't think he'd be that good. I thought
that's what I'm saying. I was surprised too. Like I said, oh yeah, his rhetoric is fine, but yeah, come on, these guys always talk a good game and then they get in there and the realities. But no, the people he was appointing, I couldn't believe it. So
yeah, no, he was just as solid as they get on energy, and he continues to argue that that's key to it. And I would, again, going back to the premise is that some friends of ours like to talk about energy as a master resource, because it makes all other activities feasible. Its availability. I mean, I show you the chart of population from 10,000 years before the Industrial Revolution until now. And what happens is world population, which is counter to much of the green movement, spikes. And I mean spikes. It's hockey stick stuff. With the discovery of dense energy beyond renewable wood that people were using up until that point, and all of a sudden the world catches fire, and people are lifted out of poverty. Their life expectancy goes through the roof, and energy is key to it all. If it's more expensive, we'll get less work done because the capacity to do work has been diminished.
So last question for you, Mr. Kish. We brought up Trump as we're recording this. He somewhat recently, the whole 34 charges and so on. How do you, is that just, oh yeah, that's par for the course, this is how stuff always went? Or is there something qualitatively different happening this cycle that it's like, wow, we've crossed the Rubicon here. Like this is really new territory.
This has been going on for quite a while, but it's reached its zenith, I hope. When I first started on the Hill, the chairman of my committee was a fellow who'd run for president by the name of Mo Udall from Arizona, Morris Udall. We fought over core issues, but we did so in a civil way. We worked well together. We would travel together. As a young person, I got to see the Soviet Union, in 1985 and look at their natural resources. And there was always but what I think the real breach came in 1994 when the House of Representatives, for the first time in well over 60 years, flipped to the Republicans. And all of a sudden, there was before then it was sort of their little nuisance. We'll treat them nicely, but we always have the votes to get what we want done. and we can move slowly and judiciously and the rest. But that really changed the dynamic. And since then, government has grown a lot. The stakes are bigger. People have outside interests that they look forward, including their own, for what they do after they get out of office or off the Hill as staff. And it's changed significantly along with the growth of government. It's where Washington is now a hip place to live. Used to not be that way. It was a little, sleepy town where the government happened to be. Now it's attracting lots of interest. Steve, what's his name from Amazon?
Jobs?
No.
Bezos? Wait, who?
Bezos.
Yeah.
There we go. I was going with Jobs too. That was my
Yeah.
problem. Get all these billionaires mixed up. Bezos has bought a huge place in Washington, D.C. I mean, Obama has a place in Washington, D.C. Presidents used to go back home. They now stay to, sling influence around and to have a say in what's going on and all the rest, because it's become the center of the universe, if you will. And with that growth it's become people don't want to lose what they've got.
Okay.
And Trump represents an existential threat to losing what they've got. So, and there's some bipartisanship in that.
If I could just one more follow up on that, is it because he's just an outsider? Like, in other words, is it because he really is the hero of Western civilization that some of his fans believe? Or is it just he's not from their cliques and he's like a bull in a china shop and they can't really play ball with him? And that's why they got to keep, because like this guy, he could just get up in front of the mic and say anything. This guy's crazy. As
Right.
opposed, how much is it just that he's a loose cannon and they like to know what's going to happen? And no, we have very carefully curated whether it's the Democrat or Republican, we know what's going to happen. The system continues and abides and grows. Whereas this Trump guy, he's not from us. Is it mostly that, or is it really that he is, the guy who's going to save the republic?
Here's the truth. He was one of them.
Okay.
He was involved in real estate development in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
When you're involved in these things and you have to play the games that you have to play in order to politically and all the rest, you pretty much get a good measure of people and what it is they're all about. And I don't think anyone would minimize his ability to, read people for what they are. So knowing what he does and then having him sort of attack that very system is really scary to a lot of people. Okay. And the truth of the matter is, I think he wants expedited. He wants to make changes that are significant, and Washington isn't into changes that are significant. They like it slow and steady, or in bursts of expansions of power and influence and money. And he represents an existential threat to that, or at least they think he does. And it's even worse now because what's the old saying about, if you're going to target the king, you got to kill him. And they certainly targeted him and went after him, and he's still fighting. So I think that really spooks a lot of them, because at that point, who knows what he's going to say or advocate or or pushed. So he's a different character.
Yeah.
And they don't like that.
Yeah, you just reminded me when the first campaign we went, and he did his thing about the famous talking about the illegal immigrants from Mexico, and he said, and some I imagine are good people or something like that.
Right.
And it was just something that if any other Republican candidate had said that their career would have been ended right there. They would have had to resign and apologize, and he just kept going, and and of course the Access Hollywood, and I think like the left. They didn't understand. Like, no, we told everyone he's a racist. Why is he still viable? You know what I mean? Like they couldn't understand. Like their normal tactics weren't working on this guy, and they were kind of just at first befuddled, and then panicked. So
I am personally amazed. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I just slapped myself and said, "Oh my God, there it is. That's the fatal cut." He did it now.
Yeah,
he said that, and he said that, and I was wrong. And time after time, and so I finally got to the point where, maybe I ought to listen a little more carefully. He's got something. So it's fascinating to watch. These are interesting times, and they're not normal, Bob.
Yeah.
Let's hope they're not normal. But it's a death grip at this point.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we should wrap it up on that cheery note. So, folks, my guest has been Dan Kish, Senior VP of Policy at the Institute for Energy Research, the best energy shop in D.C. So, Dan, thanks so much for your time and your insights.
Hey, Bob, thank you. Great to see you, and best to you, my friend.
Thank you so much, and thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.